million years all result from climate change, according to over 700 of your fellow scientists. So I was wondering whether you thought climate change could be an issue that could unite us all on left and right, moving us beyond debates about C16 to discussions at the UN at Katowice next month, where perhaps humanity might finally discover its global map of meaning.
No. I mean, there's a couple of reasons. I mean, the first reason is that I spent a lot of time reading. I worked for a UN committee for 2 years on sustainable economic and ecological development, and read a very large amount during that period of time and learned a lot, much of which made me much more optimistic than I had been before I read the relevant literature, which was a real shock to me. But the climate change issue is an absolutely catastrophic, nightmarish mess, and the idea that that will unite us that's not going to unite us. I mean, first of all, it's very difficult to separate the science from the politics, and second, even if the claims, the more radical claims, are true, we have no idea what to do about it. And so, no. And besides, it's even worse than that. Here's one of the worst things about the whole mess is, so as you project outwards with regards to your climate change projections, which are quite unreliable to begin with, and the unreliability of the measurement magnifies as you move forward in time, obviously, because the errors accumulate. And so if you go out 50 years, the error bars around the projections are already so wide that we won't be able to measure the positive or negative effects of anything we do right now. So how in the world are you going to solve a problem when you can't even measure the consequence of your actions? Like, how is that even possible? And besides that, well, what's the solution? What are we going to do? Switch to wind and solar? Well, good luck with that. Just try it and see what happens. We can't store the power. Germany tried it. They produced more carbon dioxide than they did when they started because they had to turn on their coal-fired plants again. That wasn't a very good plan. Well, we don't want nuclear. It's like, okay, what happens at night? The sun goes down. Well, isn't that something we should have taken into account? Well, we got to flip on the coal-fired plants. Well, so it was a complete catastrophe, and all that happened was the price of electricity shot up. There's like zero utility. So that's not a solution. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we should cut back. We can't consume as much as we are all consuming. It's like, well, maybe, except the data that I've read indicate that if you can get the GDP of people up to about $5,000 a year, then they start caring about the environment, and the environment cleans up. So you could make a perfectly strong case, I think, and a reasonable one, perhaps even a humane one, that the actual idea would be to get everybody in the world who's poor, desperately so, out of poverty as fast as possible, which would increase consumption in the short term, because then they'd start to care about the environment and things would clean up. It's like, okay, well, what are we going to do about global warming? Well, good luck figuring that out. I don't see a solution on the horizon. I look at Bjorn Lomborg's work. I really like Bjorn Lomborg. I think he's a real genius. You can look him up if you want. He took the UN millennial goals. There's 200 of them. That's way too many goals if you're serious about goals, by the way, because 200 goals isn't a plan. It's a wish list. You have to prioritize. I'm serious. You have to prioritize. But they won't prioritize because each of the goals has its constituents. And if you prioritize, then you irritate the constituents. But if you don't prioritize, then you can't implement the plan. So what Lomborg did was gather a teams of economists, multiple teams, some of whom were Nobel Prize-winning economists. He had them assemble teams. He had them rank order development goals in terms of their return on investment, all of the teams. Then he averaged across the teams and came up with a final list. And addressing global warming wasn't even on the list. The most fundamental, he wrote a book called How to Spend $75 Billion to Make the World a Better Place, and that's not very much money on a global scale. Almost everything that he recommended had to do with increased child nutrition in developing countries. It's like, these things are complicated, man. These are complicated. It's like, well, let's fix global warming. It's like, okay, well, good luck with that. First of all, how are you going to do that? And to think that will unite us, well, certainly not uniting us so far. So, no. And it's the kind of low-resolution thinking that just gets us absolutely nowhere. I like what Lomborg did way better. I think it's way more intelligent. So, you know, maybe if you increase child nutrition enough and you produce another, I don't know, 10 million geniuses as a consequence of that, and maybe one of them will figure out what to do about global warming. Well, I'm serious about that, you know? It's not a bad thing to increase the total sum of human brain power, you know? And so we treat these things so lightly. Well, let's fix the planet. Well, we're going to concentrate on global warming. Well, why global warming? Well, because everyone thinks that's the biggest catastrophe. Well, maybe it is, but if you don't have a solution, well, and then what about all those other problems? What are you going to do about them? Well, we'll ignore them because we can feel good about, you know, being concerned about global warming. It's like, you know, one of the reasons there's more trees in the northern hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. No one knows that, but it's true, and by a substantial margin. You know why, in part? Because people burned coal instead of wood. It's like everyone says, well, we shouldn't burn coal. It's like, okay, fair enough. What do you want to do? Burn trees instead? Because that's what poor people would have done. It's like coal isn't good. Well, it's better than burning wood. So these things are complicated. So they're unbelievably complicated. And so, no, it's not going to unite us. And we're not going to do a damn thing about it either. So it doesn't really matter. So, well, what are we going to do? You're going to stop, like, having heat? You're going to stop having electricity? You're going to stop driving your cars? You're going to stop taking trains? It's like you're not. You're going to stop using your iPhones? You're not going to do any of that. And no wonder. So, no.
Thank you for that.
Cuban says, why is it so important to have kids if the world has an overpopulation problem? Well, who says the world has an overpopulation problem? I don't buy that. So it depends on whether you think that human brains are the kind of resource that figures out how to do more with less, and that is what I think. I mean, there's been a huge argument for years between the economists and the biologists. You know, the biologists often are pessimistic, and they basically adopt a Malthusian perspective, and that is that we'll continue to breed until we exhaust the planet and do in all of our resources. And the economists always counter that by saying, hey, don't be forgetting that we can constantly figure out how to do more with less and that we're pretty damn smart. And I'm afraid I'm on the side of the economists. But even more to the point, you know, the projections right now indicate that we'll probably peak somewhere around 9 or 10 billion, sometimes by the middle of the 21st century, and then our population will start to decline pretty precipitously. And I think there's every reason to assume, especially at our current rate of technological progression, and our increasing willingness to take broader responsibility for the large-scale health of the planet, that we'll be able to manage that without too much problem. We can certainly grow enough food to do it if we put a little bit of effort into that. We're going to squeeze out a lot of other animals on the way, I'm afraid, especially some of the big predators and mammals that are of approximately our size. And that's, you know, there's a price to be paid for that. I think there's more tigers now in Texas, just in case you're wondering, than there is in the wild in the rest of the world. And so, but, you know, tigers tend to eat children, and so it's kind of rough having them around. But in any case, I'm not worried that we're going to overpopulate the planet and destroy everything. And I think that that's thinking that basically hasn't advanced since the 1960s, because we are making tremendous progress in pulling people out of the lower echelons of poverty. And there's a lot of terrible resource misuse at the lower echelons of the poverty distribution. So, for example, when people have to cook with wood, you know, that produces a tremendous amount of deforestation, for example, and that kind of thing. And I think we'll get our act together if we're fortunate. We'll peak around 9 billion. We'll be worrying about depopulation by the time some of the younger people are old. And besides, you have kids because that's part of life. So, and it's the two things aren't related in some sense as far as I'm concerned. So the trick is to have kids that are more good than harm. You know what I mean? Because people aren't only consumers, they're also producers. It's kind of appalling that we regard ourselves as consumers. So, you know, if you're going to have kids, have good kids. Make them smart, make them tough. Help them be tough. You don't really make them. Help them be tough, help them be smart, help them be responsible. And then, you know, maybe they'll do good. And that'll be good for the world and people. And like, I'm pro people, man. And so I'm not worried about that. So you know, I heard a university professor once who I also thought was completely reprehensible, who was like lecturing to a group of 18-year-old kids about how he and his wife had only decided to have one child because, you know, they didn't want to overpopulate the world. And I thought that if he'd only managed to reproduce one genetic copy of him, that was probably for the best. But then he told the whole room full of 18-year-olds that they should really think seriously about whether they have kids, and if they have any, they should just have one. And I thought, you son of a bitch, you know, you're so dedicated to the destruction of humanity and so rife with hatred for the human race that you dare to stand in front of kids who are just beginning their lives and say, well, you're a member of such a reprehensible species that the last thing you should do is multiply. It's like, no, sorry, I don't see any wisdom in that at all. And I don't think the world does have an overpopulation problem, and I don't think that there's any evidence that it does. Now, that doesn't mean that we're managing everything that we should manage properly. Like, we're really wreaking havoc on the oceans. But Boyan Slat, who's definitely worth looking up, Boyan, I think it's Boyan and Slaat, Dutch kid, has figured out, he thinks, how to get rid of half the plastic in the oceans in the next 5 years. So you could go support him. That'd be a hell of a thing to do. He's a real genius. And there's lots of ways that the burden that we're placing on our planetary resources is going to be lifted. And the trick is to get out there and do something about it. You know, like Elon Musk is a good example. It's like, okay, well, maybe we're burning too many fossil fuels, and maybe not, because I think the dangers of carbon dioxide are actually somewhat overstated. And I think there's some decent evidence for that too. But it's hard to sort it out because so much of the climate change argument is predicated on an underlying philosophy such that if you're anti-capitalist, you believe that we're going to burn up the planet. And that's just not helpful, because I can't tell if your science is right or if you're just anti-Western and anti-capitalist. So, and like, I spent 3 years working on a UN committee, the Secretary General's high-level panel on economic sustainability, I think it was called. And it produced a report in 2013. And I spent about 3 years reading everything I could get my hands on economic development and environmental sustainability. And the state of the planet is far less dismal than the doomsayers would have you believe. I do think that the one thing that we're doing is, like, we're fishing out the oceans, like, idiotically. It's really, really awful. And trawling is a very damaging process. And I think that, like, if we left the damn oceans alone for about 15 years, they'd recover. Not the huge fish like tuna, because they take a long time to develop, but oceans would come back really quickly. And, you know, but I think we'll get smart enough to do that sort of thing over the next 50 years, because, you know, human beings aren't stupid, and we've actually only been worried about the planet, let's say, since about 1960. It was only 100 years ago that it was more or less self-evident that the natural world was inexhaustible in comparison to the puny efforts of humanity. And, you know, we only figured out that there was enough of us to cause trouble by about 1960. For Christ's sake, how long do you expect it to take us to figure out how to take care of a whole planet? You know? We're doing a pretty good job for people who only stumbled onto the idea that there might be a problem something like 60 years ago. So I think we'll get it right. Especially if more and more people start to act responsibly and truthfully and all of that, which, and start working for the betterment of things instead of trying to, you know, undermine and hurt and you know, engage in identity.